Welcome to the Launch Michigan podcast, where education policy meets real action. Hosted by President and CEO Venessa Keesler. We cover research, workforce development, advocacy, and community organizing, from literacy and staffing models to redesigning high school and connecting students to trades, community colleges, and more. The Launch Michigan podcast. Big ideas, real solutions.
Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are discussing an issue that sits at the heart of every conversation about student success, Michigan's educator workforce. When we talk about literacy and achievement, graduation rates, college readiness, and workforce preparation, we're really talking about the people who make those outcomes possible every day, our educators. Research is very consistent in showing that teachers are one of the most important factors influencing student success, and Michigan continues to face significant challenges in recruiting and retaining the educators we need. We've been in a decades-long shortage situation, and we really need to focus on strengthening, growing, and retaining our educator workforce. So to help us better understand these challenges and explore what some solutions might look like, I'm joined by two outstanding leaders from the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative, or EPIC, at Michigan State University, and two good friends of mine. First, we do have Dr. Madeline Mavrogordato. Maddie is the director of EPIC and a professor of K-12 educational administration and policy at Michigan State University. She is nationally recognized for her work on education policy, educational leadership, educator recruitment and retention, and expanding opportunities for underserved students. And she's really done an amazing job here in Michigan, building on EPIC's reputation and developing an excellent connection and pipeline with policymakers, with education leaders. I don't think it's going too far to say Maddie is one of the most trusted voices in education research and ed policy in the state. When she talks, people listen. So we're really honored to have her on our podcast today. We are also joined by Dr. Jason Burns, who is a research specialist at EPIC. Jason leads research on education finance and educator compensation, including studies that examine how Michigan invests in schools, how districts use those resources, and the policies that influence educator recruitment and retention. He's also evaluated several recent state initiatives that are designed to strengthen and support Michigan's educator workforce. Jason has also been at EPIC for a while, really helped build it from its early days to where it is now, and is a huge reason why we do have this amazing research practice partnership that the state can rely on. Thank you both so much for joining us. Like I said, today's conversation is going to explore what the research tells us about the current state of Michigan's education workforce. And we really do want to dive in as well to educator compensation, why it matters, what we know about what's happening in Michigan, what Michigan residents think about it, and what it'll take to build a stronger and more sustainable profession for the future. Just a few things on our agenda for today. Small, little bite-sized nuggets, not too big. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Why do you both think educator workforce issues matter to anyone who cares about students in Michigan's future?
Educators matter because, like you mentioned in the intro, teachers are one of the most important factors shaping student outcomes. To make sure that students have the outcomes that we want, to make sure that our state is economically prosperous, to make sure that students have opportunities that requires having the highest quality educators leading classrooms today.
I think one of the other reasons why it's so important to think about the educator workforce in Michigan is so often we talk about test scores as a key focus, or we might think about things like attendance or graduation, and those are helpful outcomes that obviously we're interested in and focused on. But what we also know is that teacher quality and investment in educators actually leads to outcomes well beyond the schoolhouse, right? We're talking about things like income later in life. We're talking about things like criminal activity or lack thereof. We're talking about reliance on social services. These kinds of things are affected by teachers in classrooms for K-12 students. Education not only matters in terms of achievement and individual outcomes, but also some of these broader, bigger outcomes for individual people as well as societal outcomes.
EPIC has been studying Michigan's teacher workforce for years. It was one of the first questions that the collaborative took up back when it was founded and has been a through line for research. What would you say are some of the biggest lessons that have emerged from that research, and how would you describe the current state of the educator workforce in Michigan?
Like you said, Vanessa, we've been producing an annual teacher shortage report for 5 years at this point. We've been tracking this issue carefully and looking at it annually to be able to update and have the latest data to speak to this issue. One of the things that's really important to mention is that Michigan's current levels of teacher turnover are really at an unsustainable level. That sort of comes in a couple of different ways. One is that Michigan's supply of newly certified teachers, it's growing at record rates, but it's not growing enough to replace people who are departing the profession. It's great that we're hearing things like there are more educators going in or more students going into teacher preparation than in the past few years. That we're rebounding in these areas. We're seeing more people become certified, but we're also seeing really high rates of educator turnover. We have about 8,000 teachers a year leaving the profession in Michigan. That's an unsustainable rate to even think about backfilling with newly certified teachers. There are certain areas of education where the workforce is in particular trouble. For example, there's a growing special education population in the state of Michigan, and that exacerbates shortages that already exist in terms of the special educator workforce. Educator shortages don't look the same across all specializations in education, but they're heightened in certain areas, such as special education or educators who are qualified to work with students classified as English learners, as another example. One other key point to raise that we have found that has been consistent over time is that teacher shortages disproportionately affect students that are located in particular settings in our state, such as urban settings and rural settings, as well as in schools that serve high percentages of students who come from economically disadvantaged households, for example. So these shortages are not even across the state. They are distributed very differently depending on what district context looks like.
I appreciate you calling out the fact that it's not an easily answered question. I was at the Michigan Department of Education for 10 years. And while we were there, there was this question of, do we have enough teachers? That answer is hard to get your arms around, because what do we mean? Is it raw number of teachers? What about certification? Like you said, there's a lot more to it. It can look like you might have enough teachers, but really that doesn't mean that every school, every district has an adequate supply, not just adequate, but a high quality supply of educators to recruit from and to match to placements in their districts. Michigan in the last 10 years also suffered a significant overall shortage issue, which then further exacerbated, like you said, those regional and content areas shortages that were there even back at the early 2000s. At that point, you could already see, great, we might have a lot of elementary teachers, but we don't have enough high school math teachers. We don't have enough special ed teachers. That has been an issue historically.
When you don't have the supply, as you said a second ago, Venessa, you don't have necessarily the quality either, right? Because if you're thinking about filling a position that's a vacant position, you're hoping that you get a whole bunch of qualified applicants that you can then interview. You can think which is the best fit, which do we think is the best candidate for the position, right? And when we're talking about shortages that exist, the number of people applying for positions has just really declined. So it's not just about having somebody who can plug a hole. It's about having the right person who's talented, who's high quality, who is skilled in working with the students that they would be serving in that particular setting. These teacher shortages issues, often they're cast as numbers, but they're really strongly connected to teacher quality issues as well.
Yeah, looking at teacher attrition, in years past, the folks who are most likely to leave the profession tend to be those who are least experienced. The probability that a teacher leaves declines as they gain experience. What we've been seeing in recent years is that that's not been the case, and that actually veteran teachers, those with the highest levels of experience, have actually been the most likely to be leaving the profession. That has a really important impact on the sort of institutional knowledge that exists within schools and districts, the ability of schools to mentor oncoming teachers when they lose that really important resource that goes out the door. Then thinking about the folks who are filling those new teaching positions, research suggests that traditional teacher preparation programs do the best job of preparing teachers to lead classrooms. In the case of Michigan, over the last 15 years, the share of, or the number of folks going through traditional teacher preparation programs has really declined substantially and barely recovered in the last 3 or 4 years. That also has important implications for the kind of training that folks are getting, which means the kinds of candidates that schools and districts can pick from when they need to make a hire.
Thank you both for bringing up and expounding on what a constrained pipeline really looks like when you're talking about hiring and matching and finding the right candidate for the right position. You both touched on this a little. I'm just going to unpack it a little bit more. Do you feel like Michigan, in terms of our educator workforce, we're facing a pipeline problem, or are we facing a retention problem, or is it really all of it?
I think it's all of it.
That was a little bit of a leading question. It's like, yes, all the problems, we have them. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Coming out of the pandemic, lots of states have experienced a spike in teacher turnover, just like Michigan did. Michigan seems to be a little bit more sustained than what other states have been experiencing, where their rates of attrition have started to return closer down to pre-pandemic norms. That's not what we've had here, which is why our colleagues who have been leading that work have described attrition as unsustainable, because it's just been so persistently high. On the prep side, this is a real challenge. I mentioned about the changes in the pipeline where our new teachers are getting trained. That's an area where we have some information from other states and some anecdotal information and things that we hear from districts. This is also an area where we unfortunately don't have great data in Michigan that would let us look at that question, that would get at instructional quality and what kinds of experiences are kids having in classrooms, and being able to use that to help develop the teachers that we need.
I think for a number of years, our attention in Michigan has been on the pipeline. There have been a number of really massive investments in our state in the educator workforce, but those have largely concentrated on getting people into the teaching profession and keeping early educators through things like mentoring programs or loan forgiveness. All of those are, I think, helpful investments, right? But I think one of the things, as Jason mentioned a second ago, that we've seen that's a little bit different recently is the turnover rate of experienced teachers. We see people who are leaving the profession who previously were not as likely to leave the profession, but they're leaving at higher rates now. And what that means is we have a retention problem. You can pour as much into getting people into the profession as you want, but you are always going to have that need for that ongoing investment if you can't stabilize the workforce in terms of existing educators, particularly those who are high quality educators who may be looking around at other opportunities and options available to them outside of teaching due to just some of the challenges that they're facing in schools right now in Michigan.
If the listeners would like to read a little bit more about Michigan's investments and some recommendations there, Launch Michigan has done 2 reports in the last year or so. The first, building on what Maddie said, asked this question. We invested over $1 billion in the last 4 or 5 years into the educator workforce, and those investments were primarily around recruitment and early retention, which is incredibly important. We had a raw pipeline size issue that we were trying to solve. After the investments, it's this question of if you're pulling them into the pipeline and then they're just leaving or other people are leaving, the second report delves into the strong framework for a successful system. Like everything in education, it's not isolated issues or silver bullets. It is a system solution. So understanding what our shortages look like, what our interventions have looked like, and how retention and recruitment and all of those things work together. Maddie, you mentioned just a minute ago about some of the challenges and some of the competing things pulling on educators for why they might leave the profession. I really want to make sure that we spend time talking specifically about educator compensation. This is an interesting conversation because historically there's this whole narrative. It feels like it goes, well, teaching doesn't pay enough, but it's got all these other things that are good about it. Summers off, although most educators I know don't actually get summers off. They work a second job or they teach summer school. But there's kind of this whole, we should pay teachers more. No, we shouldn't pay teachers more. It's not just pay that matters, this kind of push-pull. It's really important to understand more about what educator compensation actually looks like in this state. It's a little bit weird to me that we're so unwilling sometimes to really engage and just say, hey, if you don't pay people enough that they can have a life and a family or whatever they want to do, and not just raw pay, but the other things that go along with it. And there's been other changes to things like pensions and whatnot that have happened that while they're not directly salary, they had impact on salary for educators. I'm really glad that you all have been a strong research-based voice in this. This is also the education problem where everybody has been educated and everybody knows an educator, so everybody knows a lot about education. It can be hard to disrupt those narratives with data about maybe some other competing narratives. Let's talk data. Let's talk facts. What would you like us to know about educator compensation in Michigan?
There are things that might be generally true across the country, but don't really hold in Michigan that complicate discussions on these issues. And you're right that compensation is multifaceted. Part of that has to do with schedules and salaries and health insurance and retirement and those sorts of things. We can touch on each of those. On the schedule, we hear a lot about teachers get summers off. And like you mentioned, there's a lot of expectations around professional development and things like that teachers are expected to do. Another thing that's worth keeping in mind, even let's just set those aside and say teachers do get time off in the summer, that balances off all the extra work that they put in during the school year. There was a recent report that came out that compared the working hours of teachers relative to other professions. Roughly half of teachers work at least 50 hours a week, relative to about 17% of all working adults. And so when you think about it that way, summers off start to sound like comp time or flex time more than actually time where you don't have any obligations and anything else. Another thing that you had mentioned, benefits, that's an area where Michigan has seen an awful lot of changes. For any teacher that started working in Michigan up until about 2010-ish or so, they were in that more traditional kind of system where they tended to have fairly generous health insurance plan. The district paid for most of that. They were in a defined benefit retirement systems like a classical pension system and were obligated to pay either nothing or very little into that. Since that time, there have been some legislative changes that have really impacted teachers. One of those would be a law that capped what districts can contribute towards employees' health insurance. That shifted the burden of funding health insurance premiums away from districts and onto teachers. There have also been a series of reforms in the retirement system, but the bulk of that has really shifted the burden of funding one's retirement away from the state under that old classical pension system and onto the educators themselves. Most teachers who have started working in the last 15 or so years are now in something much closer to a 401k system. What that means is that if there's an issue in the stock market, the state isn't obligated to make that up, to make sure that you have a consistent level of benefits, like was the case in the past. Now, what that means is that if your portfolio takes a hit, that just means you have fewer resources to fund your retirement, so that risk is all shifted to the employee. That's all leading up to salaries themselves. When you take a long view, teachers in Michigan have lost an awful lot of ground in terms of compensation. So if you go back to about 30 years ago, when you adjust for inflation, 1995 is when teacher compensation peaked in Michigan. If teacher salaries had kept pace with inflation since 1995, the average teacher would earn just over $100,000 right now. Thinking back to 1995, that would have been their salary, but most of their health insurance would have been covered by their employer. They would have been in that classical defined benefit pension system. Since 1995, when you, again, adjusting for inflation, teacher salaries in Michigan, for the average teacher that is, have fallen about 29%. That's more than any other state. Indiana is the next closest, and it saw teacher salaries decline since 1995 by about 21%. So a big gap between Michigan and Indiana. What that underscores is that Michigan actually used to be a pretty high-paying state for teachers. From 1970, which is as far back as we had data, so a half a century sounds like a good time span to look at. From 1970 to about 2008, Michigan was a top 10 paying state for teachers. And for most of that time, Michigan was in the top 5. As recently as 2016, Michigan was ranked 11th in terms of teacher salaries. Since that time, we have fallen to 22nd, where we stand right now. That big decline coincides with a few important trends that we talked about earlier. The big decline in teacher prep enrollment started about 2 years after the biggest, sharpest decline in teacher salaries. The 4 most recent years where we've seen teacher attrition at unsustainable rates, that's the lowest average teacher salaries, and when you adjust for inflation, in the last half century. These trends in compensation really align with some of the trends concerning workforce trends that we've noted. So that was the picture for the average teacher across Michigan. Things look worse when you look at the average starting compensation. Michigan ranks 45th in terms of starting teacher salaries. As of about 2017, we were ranked 31st, so in the lower part of the middle of the pack, and now we are near the bottom. A lot of that has to do with other states being a lot more intentional to pass reforms that increase compensation, specifically for early career teachers. Just a couple of weeks ago, North Carolina, which is one of the states that had a lower average starting salary than Michigan, they passed a budget that raised starting wages by about 17% for teachers. Given the course that Michigan has seen, it's likely to compare even worse. When you pair those declining average salaries with the idea that in Michigan, the average teacher earns about 29% less than other college graduates, you can imagine that attracting people into the teaching profession, particularly people with strong skills, it's a much harder sell when the idea is that you're going to be paid 30% less than your peers who go to college and that your wages are barely going to keep up with inflation, if at all.
Jason, you mentioned some of those changes to the way we structured retirement. Some of that paid down Michigan's pension debt. Fairly soon, that debt will be paid down and more money will be available in the K-12 system. Money coming back into the budget that has been used for debt pay down, essentially. Some actuary somewhere is going to be like, that is the worst explanation of what's happened, but that's basically what's going to happen. So to me, a critical question that we all need to lock in on, in the parlance of the kids, is as these billions of dollars, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion will be available to K-12, a sustained $4 billion to the school aid fund. Shouldn't it go to teacher compensation, knowing that's where we've taken from in the last years? So we declined by 29% relative inflation, and that's the worst. So we're the worst in terms of how our salaries have fallen. And you pointed out the correlation, at least, between when these cuts happened and then when we saw things in the pipeline. Teacher prep declined, teacher shortage. And I am always really compelled by this 45th in the nation for starting teacher salary. I think, again, we're kind of middle of the pack with overall teacher salary. You could argue about that, but we're like at the very bottom in terms of starting teacher salary. And there's, again, good evidence both in the research and then, I don't want to say anecdotally, but a place like Detroit Public Community School District, which has made sure to pay teachers, invested in higher teacher salaries, starting teacher salaries, and ongoing, and has started to see gains. I cite the statistic all the time about DPSCD. This is a little bit of a bird walk, but in a recent national study on growth coming out of the Harvard Center for Strategic Research, they're in the 95th percentile for growth for kids of color nationally, and 88th percentile growth for all kids. Those are remarkable statistics in a state that is struggling to be anywhere but the bottom in almost most metrics. Again, I'm not saying I did a causal study. There's more that Dr. Vitti has done in Detroit than just pay teachers. He's also coupled it with high quality curriculum and structural reforms and meaningful data. But a core ingredient, one of their 5 strategic plans, is invest in our educators. So sometimes we look all over the nation, and sometimes we can look close to home to a district that's getting incredible gains and look at their ingredients. And one is they said talent matters, teachers matter, and compensation matters. There's a really compelling story here about this disinvestment, what it's created. People are like, oh, it's expensive to raise teacher salaries, or it would be expensive to redo healthcare, or expensive to put them back into a defined compensation, or whatever. Curious to know what you think about the cost of not investing in educator compensation.
The cost of not investing can be pretty stark. There's a lot of research that ties student achievement as measured by test scores and kind of the standard sort of student outcomes that we look at correlated with economic growth. That's true internationally when you compare across countries. That's also true within the US when you compare across states. So if we choose not to invest in our educators, one of the most important resources for improving student achievement, that has long-term implications for the economic vitality of the state. Maddie mentioned there's some research that, these are things that are like intuitive, but it's nice to have research that backs it up, which is that education creates opportunities. When people don't have opportunities, then you see things like higher crime rates, higher rates of, say, teenage pregnancy, reliance on social services. All of those things incur costs as well. Taking a step back out of educator compensation in particular to some of the work that looks at the relationship between education funding and student outcomes have found that there's a positive return on investment just based on savings in criminal justice costs. Obviously, there are some bounds, and it doesn't mean that you can spend forever, but there's a positive return on investment even when you just focus on that. What that means is even if you never had kids, even if your kids are completely out of the system, what that means is that you still benefit from having a strong public education system. It means that there's a stronger economy that can fund the services that we all need. That includes like roads, healthcare for seniors and the disabled and things like that. It matters to everyone. It matters to the whole community.
One of the biggest issues that we face when it comes to increasing teacher compensation has to do with how little the public really understands where we are as a state in this area. As Jason said, hey, salaries were the highest when we adjust for inflation in 1995. If we look back to 1995, if you're talking to an average Michigan adult, a voter, many of the people who you'd be talking to are people who were educated in schools when people were investing more in education and teachers were getting paid more. So there's this perception, right, of like, teachers are well compensated. And it's just not true. Over time, this has really declined, and I don't think the public understands the degree to which this has declined. I also don't know how clearly the public understands the connection between instructional investments. The top way you can invest in instruction in today's classrooms is investing in the educator in those classrooms. So we know that investing, for example, in educator compensation, it's one of the best things you can do to move the needle in terms of putting money into today's classroom. It's a really hard thing to do given the resources that schools have right now to draw from. I'm glad you raised the example of Detroit and DPSCD. They have done excellent work, and it's amazing to see some of this come to fruition, all of their investments and the moves that they've made very strategically as a district. Credit to Dr. Vitti and team for standing the course, sticking to the plan, and really thinking strategically there. I think one of the other things, though, that is important to mention is that because of the student population that DPSCD serves, the state offers more funding to DPSCD through many sources. And they deserve that funding. They absolutely deserve that funding. I am not at all saying that they don't. But I think it's important just to note that many school districts across the state do not receive the level of funding that our districts that serve very high portions of economically disadvantaged students do. So it is very challenging for a lot of school districts around our state to say, we are going to meaningfully invest in educator compensation in the same way that DPSCD has, because it's very limited the pot of money that districts receive from the state. One of the biggest sort of misnomers that exists in this area too, it's amazing how folks around me, my own neighbors, right? If we have a millage that's on the ballot and it has to do with, oh, we're going to rebuild our elementary schools, we're going to renovate. Okay, fine. There's always a debate that exists that comes up where people say, we shouldn't be redoing our buildings. We should just be paying our teachers more, right? Our teachers deserve more pay. But the public doesn't understand that we can't leverage a millage to pay teachers more due to the way that state policy exists in Michigan. If we're going to say we're going to take teacher compensation issues seriously in our state, it's going to have to be state policymakers that are really engaging in this conversation, because otherwise you're not going to have the ability to systematically increase educator compensation with the per pupil funding that is coming to schools and districts right now.
Something I think that complicates discussions around teacher salaries, it depends on a lot on what your reference is. So for instance, like I mentioned, relative to teachers in the past, pay has declined an awful lot. When you look at Michigan's median income, it's right about what the average teacher salary is. And so there are probably a lot of people who think that, oh, that's right about in kind of the middle of the pack, and so that's okay. But one factor driving that is that I think just a little bit under a third or so of Michigan adults have a bachelor's degree. So then it becomes important to consider what the wages are for bachelor's degrees. I think that helping folks understand that the key question is, coming back to this theme, is like, what does it take to draw the right talent into the profession and to keep them there that's going to improve the outcomes that we need as a state?
Thank you for clarifying that. And Maddie, thank you for pointing very clearly that this is a state policy issue to solve. I bet most local superintendents would love to pay teachers more and get more. I don't think there's very many local superintendents looking at their budgets and saying, man, we got a bunch of extra money. Should we give it to teachers or should we do something else with it? Local budgets have a lot of things pulling on them and the funds available. If we want to be a state that invests like North Carolina, then it's a state policy play. Locals will have to make the right decisions too. So I think it's also interesting to think about what would the state investment coupled with requirements be, so it can't just get soaked in and put to other places. It does have to be something structural statewide. It's not going to be solved just by local decisions. So that's a great point. You mentioned public opinion. EPIC has also done a lot of research on public opinion around educators' compensation. What does the public think about these issues?
Sorry. For the past 3 years now, we have been doing some public opinion polling by working with the folks who do the long-running State of the State survey, which takes public opinion on a whole range of issues. And so we've included some questions on that to better understand where the public is on the teaching profession, including teacher compensation. And to do that, we've adapted some questions that have been asked in national samples about what does the public think about where teacher salaries are and what teacher salaries should be. What we've seen consistently over the last 3 years is pretty strong support for increasing teacher salaries, with the strongest support for increasing salaries for new teachers. About 3 out of every 4 Michiganders think that teachers should earn more at the beginning of their career. When you ask them how much more, the answer is about $12,000 more. So about a 25% raise is what the public thinks that new teachers should earn. It's a little bit more modest when you talk about teachers on average. That works out to be about $4,300. So strong support for increasing compensation across the board, particularly for new teachers. For some perspective on that, if the average Michigan teacher earned about $4,300 more, that would bring us up to about the national average. So that's not something that would put us up at the level of New Jersey or California. That would bring Michigan up to what the typical teacher in the United States earns.
That is so interesting and important, I think, for us to understand that so many Michiganders support raising salaries for teachers. And let's just do a quick calculation. There's about 6,000 to 8,000 new teachers a year, depending on how you define it. If we were to raise all their salaries by 12,000, which is what Michiganders support, that would be roughly 100 million. But Jason, I know you've done some calculations about if we were to put in the investment to raise everybody's salaries up to that average, that investment would be, I've heard you say elsewhere, 350 million annual investment.
Between $350 and $400 million. And it comes down to how you would define teacher in making those calculations. But that would be roughly the investment needed to bring the average Michigan teacher salary up in line with public preferences.
Right. So even if we think about this idea that with the MSU pay down, there's $3 to $4 billion that is going to be available to K-12, seems like a really good place to spend 400 million of that. That's not even a fourth of that money to spend that annually on making sure that we compensate our educators. I think policymakers should really take a hard look at that.
Yeah, and I think policymakers have tried to make some effort in that area. So there have been a few years in the past couple budgets where there have been appropriations for educator compensation, but it's all one-time funding. I'm sure that money is welcome, but that doesn't necessarily change the incentives around coming into the profession or staying in the profession because those investments aren't long-term. The public, again, really supportive of increasing teacher compensation. We've tried to better understand what kind of trade-offs would be involved in that and what does the public think about those. One thing that we've done is we've asked where would that money come from? And the most popular solution for finding money to raise teacher compensation is to cut non-educational programs. So don't ask districts to have larger class sizes. Don't cut the services that districts provide to students. Trying to find the funding from somewhere else. One of the challenges associated with that is then we asked people, we gave them different areas of the state budget that account for 85 to 90% of state spending each year and said, consider this budget area. Do you think that we should be spending more, less, or the same amount of money in this area? And K-12 education comes out on top. About 2/3 of Michiganders believe that we should be spending more on K-12 education. That beats out everything else, roads and bridges, healthcare, the environment, recreation, all of those sorts of things. Education comes out on top. Most of those other programs are also still pretty popular themselves. And so it's not immediately clear to say to policymakers like, oh, this looks like the fat that you could trim that is less popular. We polled about things like increasing taxes, which are not terribly popular, perhaps unsurprisingly, in an abstract sense. About 1 in 4 Michiganders said that they would be okay paying more in taxes to raise teacher salaries. To try to make some things more concrete, we did ask folks, would you be willing to pay $25 a year more in taxes if it meant that teachers would earn X amount of dollars? We asked different amounts of tax increases. There's majority support for increasing taxes by $50 to a little bit under $100 per tax filer. Interestingly, that would generate almost enough money to bring teacher salaries in line with public preferences. We do ask people more specifically, essentially, like for the cost of a Netflix subscription, would you be willing to pay teachers more? The answer tends to be yes, I guess less than the cost of a Netflix subscription, given what that is now.
That is a really interesting finding. I know you've done some work on professional learning, what kind of professional learning they value. You're familiar with the research. So again, we know compensation matters and other things matter too. Could you comment a little bit on what else matters when we think about a systems approach to improving education and educator workforce?
Obviously, educator compensation is a key piece of this idea of both recruiting and retaining educators. So are a few other things that research really points to as being particularly meaningful. One is making sure that the working conditions where teachers are working are helpful to facilitating their work and not getting in the way of them doing what they signed up to do, which is teach kids and nurture children in our state. And so This is something that's really important to focus on. Teachers need to be able to show up in places that they're excited to go to. And particular aspects of working conditions that really matter are things like dealing with issues around student discipline, making sure that the school is a safe place where people feel safe, teachers feel safe, students feel safe. Those are the kinds of things that matter a lot in terms of improving working conditions for educators. Nobody wants to go to a building each day where they don't feel safe or where they're having to focus on student discipline as an educator because they're not able to focus then on teaching and learning. So that's one key area that really matters. And another has to do with professional learning. Educators want to grow and continue to develop and not become stagnant in their craft and what they do. It's really important that we continue to make sure that we're investing in professional development for our educators as well.
We have done a little bit of work in this space. A lot of work comes from folks who have done this in other places to better understand teachers' preferences. And like Maddie mentioned, things like working conditions, leadership, having a supportive leader in your building is actually a really strong predictor of whether someone chooses to work in a building and chooses to remain in that school. And so I think what this points at is that along with these really important conversations around compensation, which are obviously going to be really important for recruiting and retaining our best teachers, working to help leaders become more effective at running their buildings. That's not to say that they're ineffective now, and provide more support and improve working conditions is something that we as a state and at the local level can also work on to try to make the environment of teaching just more sustainable. On this topic, something that I've thought a lot about is there's a long-running poll where they ask Americans, would you want your child to become a teacher or the child of a close family member or friend? That used to be in the 70s, 70% or so of folks said that they would want their child to become a teacher. That has dropped down to about 40% among American adults. And more recently, folks have started asking that same question to teachers, and it's about 22%. So only 22% of current teachers would recommend the profession to someone else. I think that has an awful lot of sway in being able to recruit our young people into the profession, because teachers are one of the most important voices and ambassadors for the profession that we have. Improving those kinds of things like working conditions, I think would go a long way to making the profession more sustainable.
As I'm listening to you, and I am familiar with this research, but I'm just struck again by how stark this is. I know you may not weigh in, but I'm saying as a policy advocate, the first thing we should look at with investments with that NIPSERS money is how are we going to support our educators? How are we going to deal with the fact that we have taken the steepest decline in teacher salaries since 1995 in the nation? Education shouldn't be all about altruism. We shouldn't expect to have a top 10 performing state if we're not willing to pay our talent. Maddie, Jason, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Launch Michigan podcast. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe on whichever platform you use to get your podcasts. To learn more about sponsoring an episode of the Launch Michigan podcast, please email communications@launchmichigan.org. This episode was hosted by Dr. Venessa Keesler, President and CEO of Launch Michigan, and produced by Emily Fishkin, our Senior Communications Manager. Special thanks to Dr. Madeline Mavrogordato, Dr. Jason Burns, Emily Moore, and Bailey Paget from the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative at Michigan State University for their help in coordinating the topics for this episode. Check out the link in our show notes to read their most recent report on teacher compensation. Join us in 2 weeks for another great episode on education policy, research, and reform in Michigan.